You've probably never thought much about the trains you ride, right? They're just a means to get from point A to point B. But what if the train you're on could take you somewhere far darker than you ever imagined? Somewhere that no one can hear your screams. I used to think the same until the night I boarded the wrong train, and now I have no idea how to get back. It started like any other night. I was working late at the office, my eyes glued to the computer screen, ticking off tasks that never seemed to end. By the time I left, it was already past midnight. The streets were empty, the world quieter than usual. I needed to get home, but I didn't feel like walking the long way, so I decided to take the train. It was the quickest route, or so I thought. I got to the station, and it was dead silent. No one else in sight. That's when I noticed something strange. The platform was completely deserted. At this hour, that wasn't so unusual, but it still gave me a sense of unease. The only thing moving was the train, pulling into the station like any other. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was just a regular train, right? I stepped inside, and the moment I did, something felt off. The carriage was empty, not a single person in sight. Now, this was odd. I've taken this train dozens of times, and it's never been this quiet. But, being tired and eager to get home, I brushed it off and found a seat by the door. I pulled out my phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in the back of my mind. But then, the lights flickered. It wasn't much at first, just a small glitch. But the flickering got worse, faster, until finally, they went out completely. I sat there in the pitch black for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to turn on my flashlight when the lights suddenly came back on. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavier, colder, and the silence, it was gone. The train wasn't empty anymore. I couldn't understand it. Where did these people come from? The passengers, sitting in their seats, staring straight ahead as if they didn't even notice me. And then, one of them spoke. A woman, her eyes dark and hollow, whispered to me, "You've just joined us. Welcome aboard." I didn't know what she meant or what was going on, but before I could ask, the train began to move, faster than I'd ever felt it before. I tried to call for help, but the words didn't make it past my lips. The train was going somewhere, but I had no idea where. And that's when I saw it. The first stop. It wasn't on any map, not even on the schedule. It was a place no one should ever have to see. But now, it's too late. I've already crossed the line, and I don't know if I'll ever make it back. Where am I going? Who are these people? And what's waiting at the next stop? I don't have the answers yet, but maybe, just maybe, I'll find out before it's too late. Stay tuned because the ride has only just begun. I kept my eyes on the other passengers, my heart racing. The woman who had spoken to me, her voice low and smooth, hadn't looked away from me once. She was tall, with dark hair falling in waves around her face. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way she held herself that made me uneasy. It wasn't just her calm demeanor in the face of this bizarre situation. It was the way everyone else on the train acted too. They all seemed so disconnected. They weren't looking at me, weren't reacting to anything, not even the strange, relentless motion of the train as it picked up speed. I scanned the other passengers, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was a man sitting in the seat across from me, his head tilted back, eyes closed, as if he was asleep. But something was off about him. His clothes were too neat, his hair too perfect for someone who had just been picked up by a random train at midnight. There was another woman further down, her face pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles under her eyes. She was clutching a small bag to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I wanted to ask someone what was going on, but my voice caught in my throat. It felt like the air in the carriage had thickened, like every word I spoke would be swallowed by the oppressive silence. I turned back to the woman who had welcomed me, my hands shaking slightly as I asked, "Where are we going?" Her lips curled into a faint smile, and she leaned back in her seat, not bothering to look at me directly. "It's not where we're going that matters," she said, her voice distant, "but where we've been." That didn't make any sense. I was about to question her again when the train suddenly jerked, throwing me forward into the seat in front of me. The lights flickered again, this time more violently. The whole carriage seemed to shudder, like it was fighting against the rails beneath it. I could feel a strange pressure in my ears, like the train was descending into some kind of void. For a moment, everything went black again. When the lights came back on, the scenery outside the window had changed. We weren't speeding through the city anymore. No, we were surrounded by darkness, endless stretches of nothing. I could see only a faint glow ahead of us, a dim light in the distance that seemed to flicker and pulse, like a beacon. It didn't look like any station I'd ever seen. It looked wrong. A chill ran through me, and I turned back to the woman, my voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. I watched her make her way down the aisle toward the back of the train, her footsteps soft but deliberate. The other passengers didn't seem to react, still locked in their own silent worlds. They didn't care. I stood up too, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. Something was very wrong. This wasn't just a train ride anymore. This was something else, something far more dangerous. I took a hesitant step toward the door at the end of the carriage, the one the woman had disappeared through. My hand rested on the cold metal handle, and I was about to pull it open when a voice stopped me. It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, coming from the seat beside mine. I turned to face him, and I saw the same lifeless stare in his eyes that I had seen in the others. "Don't open that door," he said, his voice low but urgent. I froze, my hand still on the door. "Why? What's behind it?" He looked at me, his expression barely changing. "You don't want to know. Trust me." I didn't know what to say. The fear was crawling up my spine again, making it hard to breathe. The man's warning echoed in my mind as I reluctantly pulled my hand away from the door. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for us, something that wouldn't stop until it had us all. The train slowed down again, the screeching sound of the brakes cutting through the silence. I turned toward the window, but this time I could see something more clearly. The flickering light in the distance was no longer just a glow. It was a large, looming structure, its outline jagged and unsettling. It looked like some kind of abandoned facility, the kind of place you'd expect to see in nightmares. And then, the intercom crackled to life. "Next stop, the Forgotten Zone. Prepare to disembark." The woman from earlier returned to her seat, her gaze meeting mine once more. There was a look in her eyes now, a knowing, a sense of finality that chilled me to the bone. She didn't need to say anything. I knew then, more than ever, that I wasn't getting off this train the way I thought I would. And whatever awaited us at the Forgotten Zone, I wasn't sure I was ready for it. But I didn't have a choice. None of us did. The train was taking us there, whether we liked it or not. The train came to a slow, grinding halt. The screeching sound of the brakes rattled my bones, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Every passenger in the carriage sat as still as statues, their eyes locked on the front of the train, as if awaiting some unspoken command. I was no different. My heart raced, my palms clammy, and my mind was a whirlwind of questions. But none of them seemed to matter now. I wasn't in control here. None of us were. The woman, Luna, what was her real name, sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a strange calmness radiating from her as the train stopped. I could sense she knew more than she was telling, but I didn't know how to ask. The fear, the uncertainty, it all gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Not yet. The voice on the intercom crackled again, soft and eerie, sending a chill down my spine. "Welcome to the Forgotten Zone. Please disembark. The authority awaits." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The authority. The words alone were enough to send my mind spiraling. What was this authority? The dark figure I had seen earlier, the one who had ripped the woman's arm off. Was it coming for us next? Was it going to pick us off one by one, like some twisted game of survival? I could feel the dread settle in my stomach like a stone. I turned to the man who had warned me about opening the door earlier. His face was even paler now, his eyes wide with fear. "You heard them," he said, his voice trembling. "We don't want to go there. Trust me." Before I could respond, Luna stood up, her movements graceful and deliberate, as if she were preparing for something inevitable. "Don't listen to him," she said, her voice low but firm. "The Forgotten Zone is where we need to be." I looked at her, confusion and fear clouding my mind. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Where else can we go? This train is taking us there whether we want it or not." Luna's eyes flickered toward the door, and she nodded slowly. "Exactly. But the real question is, what happens if we don't disembark? What if we stay on the train when it's time to leave? That's the real danger." Her words only made my fear worse. What was she talking about? Staying on the train? But before I could ask, the man beside me stood up abruptly, his face twisted with panic. "I'm not staying here. I'm getting off," he shouted, his voice cracking. I watched in stunned silence as he hurried toward the door, his footsteps heavy and fast. Luna didn't stop him, but her gaze followed him intently. He reached the door, grabbed the handle, and opened it. The cold wind rushed in, and I could see the desolate landscape outside, a barren wasteland that stretched as far as the eye could see. But something else was out there too. Movement. Shadows flickered in the distance. Something was waiting. The man froze, his hand still on the door, staring out into the blackness. His breath hitched, and his body tensed as if he could feel the weight of whatever lurked out there. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I couldn't see what he was looking at, but I didn't need to. I could feel it. A presence. Something unnatural. Something wrong. Luna's voice cut through the silence. "You shouldn't have opened the door. Now they know we're here." And just like that, I knew we were in even deeper trouble. The man slammed the door shut and turned back toward the group, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. I don't understand," he stammered, his words coming out in fits. There's something out there." Luna's eyes narrowed, and her tone softened, almost pitying. "You think you're the only one who's seen them? You think you're the only one who's been dragged into this nightmare?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're not. We all have." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying, but before I could ask more questions, the train lurched forward again. The force of it pushed me back into my seat, and the air grew colder, the silence even thicker. Through the window, I saw the faint outline of a massive structure, a towering, decaying building, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling. It looked like something from a nightmare, a place that had long since been abandoned by time. "We're here," Luna said simply, her gaze never leaving the window. The train slowed to a crawl as we approached the structure. The wind outside howled, like something was calling to us, urging us to come closer. My chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever lay behind those walls, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't good. It wasn't supposed to be there. The doors of the train opened, and I felt a sudden pull in my chest, an overwhelming compulsion to leave the safety of the carriage. Every part of me screamed to stay inside, to wait, to hope that this was all just a bad dream. But the pull was too strong. Without even realizing it, my feet were moving, carrying me toward the door. I glanced back at the others. Some were getting up too, drawn by the same force. Others remained seated, looking resigned, like they knew this was their fate. And then, with a final deafening screech, the train stopped. The intercom buzzed once more. "Exit now, or you will never leave." The words echoed in my mind as I stepped off the train, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I knew deep down that the worst was still to come. Whatever was waiting for us in the forgotten zone, we weren't ready for it. And neither was the man beside me, whose face was now twisted with fear. The moment I stepped off the train, I felt a coldness seep into my bones, not just from the air, but from the place itself. It was as if the ground beneath my feet was not solid, as though it had once been something, but now it was hollow. I could hear the faint hum of something deep underground, like an engine that had long since been turned off, but still reverberated through the earth. The building looming ahead was massive, its windows like black eyes staring down at us. There was a sense of dread hanging in the air, thick and suffocating, like we were standing on the edge of something far worse than we could understand. The others, those who had left the train with me, hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Some of them didn't look like they even wanted to be here. But the pull of this place was undeniable. Their footsteps were tentative, uncertain, yet they moved forward all the same. The man who had opened the door earlier, the one who had warned us, was ahead of me now, moving briskly, his back straight, but his face was ashen, his eyes darting around nervously. Luna walked beside me, her face unreadable. Her silence was deafening, and for the first time since meeting her, I began to doubt everything she had said. Was she really our guide here, or was she as lost as the rest of us? I stole a glance at her, but she seemed to be lost in thought, her eyes focused on something I couldn't see. The other passengers too were quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their bodies tense, as if we were all waiting for something to happen. The wind picked up, and with it came the sound of something scratching against the walls of the massive structure. I stopped in my tracks, the hairs on my neck standing on end. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, a scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but I knew one thing. It was close, too close. The man ahead of me, the one who had opened the door, suddenly froze. His eyes widened, and his breathing became shallow. He turned around, his face pale. I hear something, he said, his voice trembling. It's coming from the building. I wanted to tell him it was just the wind, just some part of this abandoned place creaking under the weight of time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something moving in there, something alive, Or maybe it was dead. I didn't know which was worse. Luna grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Whatever is in there, it's not friendly, and we can't afford to stand here and wait for it to come to us." I didn't argue. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of it deafening in my ears. We continued walking, each step heavier than the last. The further we got into the building, the more I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the air growing thicker, harder to breathe. I could see the others now, their faces set in grim determination, but there was something in their eyes, a flicker of fear they couldn't hide. The building's interior was even worse than the outside. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floors cracked and uneven. The air smelled stale, like something had been rotting here for decades. The faint sound of scratching was still there, growing louder with every passing second. But now, there was something else. Voices. Soft, indistinguishable at first, but then clearer, more distinct. Whispers. The group fell silent as we listened, our breath coming in shallow gasps. The voices were close now, just beyond the walls, behind the doors. They sounded like, please, like people begging for something, but I couldn't tell for what. The closer we got to the center of the building, the louder the whispers became, until they were all I could hear. Luna stopped suddenly, and I almost ran into her. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway ahead. "They're here," she said softly, almost to herself. "They've always been here." I was about to ask her what she meant when a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by a shrill scream that made my blood run cold. It sounded like it was coming from above us, from a higher floor. The scream echoed off the walls, long and drawn out, until it was cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps. Something was coming, and I had no idea how to stop it. Panic surged through the group. The man ahead of me stumbled back, his face filled with terror. "What is that?" he shouted. "What's happening?" Before anyone could respond, the walls trembled, and a door on the far side of the hall exploded open. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its body wrapped in tattered, filthy cloth. Its face was obscured by a hood, but there was no mistaking the red, glowing eyes that burned through the darkness. The creature stood motionless for a moment, then took a slow, deliberate step toward us. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I could feel them closing in, coming from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest as the group backed up, trying to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. Luna's voice broke through the rising panic. "We have to fight," she said, her words calm but urgent. "Or we'll be next." The ground beneath us shook again, and a loud screech filled the air, followed by a bone-chilling growl. It was all I could do to keep my feet planted, to keep from running blindly into the unknown. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and in that instant, I knew. There was no escape. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, like twin embers burning in the pitch-black night. My heart skipped a beat as it took another slow, deliberate step toward us. I couldn't move, my body frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away from those fiery eyes. The air around us grew heavier, thick with an oppressive silence, as if the world itself had stopped to watch. And then, just as I thought it was about to strike, another sound erupted, a distant, thunderous crash from deeper within the building. The creature stopped in its tracks, its head turning slowly toward the sound. Before anyone could react, the ground beneath our feet trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the creature moving. Something else was coming. The sound grew louder, closer, something massive, something not human. A new presence, far more powerful than the creature in front of us, was now closing in on us. Luna's grip tightened on my arm, her knuckles pale. "This isn't good," she whispered, her voice strained with fear. "This isn't just a monster. This is something far worse." I turned to her, panic rising in my chest. "What do you mean worse? What's happening?" I wanted to scream, to ask if there was any way out of this madness, but I couldn't form the words. My throat was dry, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Luna's eyes darted toward the shadows ahead of us, where the echoes of something terrifying were growing louder. "We're not just in the wrong place, James," she said, her voice shaking. "We're in the wrong time." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach, but before I could process what she meant, a loud, deafening roar split the air. The walls shook, and the floor cracked beneath our feet. The thing from the shadows was close now, closer than I could comprehend, and it was angry. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement, and from the depths of the hallway emerged another figure, this one even larger than the first. It was humanoid in shape, but far more grotesque. Its skin stretched taut over its bones, and its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were hollow, black pits. It towered over the others, its mouth a jagged slit that stretched far too wide to be natural. The moment it stepped into the faint light, I could see that it wasn't just one creature. It was a swarm, an army, a dark legion that had been lying dormant, waiting for something or someone to awaken it. The first creature, the one with the glowing eyes, seemed to shrink in comparison to the new arrival. It backed away, as if bowing to a far superior force. The other passengers around me were now in full panic mode, their faces contorted in horror as they screamed and scrambled to find an exit. But there was none. We were trapped. I could feel the pressure mounting, the air growing heavier by the second. "We need to go, now!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with panic. But Luna didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at the giant creature, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. "They've been waiting for us," she muttered under her breath, barely audible. "They know who we are, and they want us to stay." A chill ran down my spine. The way she said it, the tone in her voice, it was as if she had been here before, as if she had seen this happen over and over again. I turned to her, desperate for answers. "What are you talking about? What do you mean they want us to stay?" But Luna didn't answer. Instead, she looked up at the towering figure with a mixture of fear and regret. "It's already too late. There's no leaving now, not without paying the price." Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from behind us. There was no escape. The creature, the one with the burning eyes, turned toward us, and in that moment, it didn't just look at me. It looked through me, as if it could see into my very soul. I backed up instinctively, my mind racing, but the shadows around us seemed to grow darker, the air more suffocating. The building was alive, pulsating with a terrible energy that seemed to feed off our fear. The whispers from before were louder now, filling my ears, growing into a cacophony of voices that all seemed to say the same thing. "You're here to stay." A new figure appeared in the doorway, a silhouette standing just outside the pale light. I couldn't make out its features, but the feeling of dread that surged through me was enough to know it wasn't another of the monstrous creatures. This one was different. It was human. It stepped into the light, revealing a face that looked almost familiar. It was a man, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, glowing like the others. He smiled, though it was more of a grimace than a true expression of happiness. "You should have never gotten off this train," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "Now, you're all ours." The ground beneath us shook once more, and in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just a passenger anymore. I was part of the game, and the game had only just begun. The air crackled with an eerie energy as the man in the old uniform stepped fully into the light. His smile widened, and the shadows around us seemed to twist and stretch with a life of their own. "You should have never gotten off this train," he repeated, his voice low and menacing, each word laced with a hidden threat. Luna's face twisted with fear, but she stepped forward, standing between me and the figure, as if trying to shield me. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "None of us do. We're all part of this now. There's no escape." The figure's eyes flickered with amusement, but there was no warmth in them. "Escape?" he repeated almost to himself. "Oh, there's no escape. You're already here, and the train doesn't stop." I could feel the weight of his words sink into me, the truth of them settling deep into my bones. We weren't just trapped physically on this train. We were trapped in time, in a place beyond our own reality, and there was no going back. The train, this cursed journey, was the only constant in a world that didn't make sense anymore. It was alive, and it was feeding off our fear, our desperation. The first creature, the one with the glowing eyes, shifted uneasily behind the man. But as it stepped forward, the ground beneath us trembled once more. This time, it wasn't the creature that caused the rumble. It was something far more sinister. From the far corner of the room, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, pooling together until they formed a figure, a giant, hulking presence, even larger than the creatures we had already seen. It was a shape made of dark smoke and flesh, its eyes blazing with a malicious hunger. Luna's breath hitched in her throat. "This is it," she murmured. "The end game." Before I could react, the giant figure lunged, its massive hands reaching out to grab Luna. She didn't scream, but I saw the terror in her eyes as she was yanked into the air, the creature's grip crushing her body. It shook her like a rag doll, its massive claws sinking into her sides. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think, as the creature tossed her aside like she was nothing more than a nuisance. But Luna's fall wasn't the end. As she hit the ground with a sickening thud, her body didn't stop moving. Instead, she contorted and twisted in ways that were impossible for any human to endure. Her eyes, those bright, wide eyes, flashed with something I couldn't recognize, and for a split second, it was as if the world itself paused. Then everything changed. The creature froze, its hands still outstretched, and the figure in the uniform took a slow step back, his smile faltering. Luna's body began to rise from the ground, her limbs stretching unnaturally, her entire form glowing with an ethereal light. It wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something far more powerful, something ancient. "You were right, Luna," I whispered, barely able to comprehend what was happening. "You are part of this." With a sudden deafening crack, the train seemed to lurch forward, its metal screeching as if it were alive and in pain. The lights flickered and went out completely, leaving only the cold glow from Luna's transformed body. The world around us seemed to warp and bend, and the shadows crept closer, their dark tendrils reaching out like a mass of hungry creatures. But Luna, or whatever she had become, raised her arms, and the shadows recoiled, unable to touch her. "You should have stayed on the track, Luna," the figure in the uniform said softly, almost sorrowfully. "Now, it's too late." But Luna's eyes burned with fire, and with a single terrifying movement, she reached forward and grabbed the figure by the throat. The room seemed to hold its breath as she pulled him toward her, his body trembling under her grip. For a moment, it looked like she was going to destroy him, to tear him apart. But instead, something unexpected happened. Luna, with a final swift motion, flung him into the shadows, and as he vanished from sight, a low, otherworldly growl filled the air. The ground shook violently, and the train shuddered beneath our feet. I could hear the distant echoes of whispers, voices from every direction, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Then it stopped. The lights flickered back on, the train's motion slowed, and the world seemed to return to its normal, albeit twisted state. Luna's form began to shrink, her glowing body returning to human form. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her body racked with exhaustion. "It's not over," she said, her voice barely audible. "The train's still moving. We're still trapped." I looked around, trying to understand, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. But before I could respond, a voice boomed from the intercom above, cold and emotionless. "Next stop, the end." And as the train rattled onward, we realized with terrifying clarity that this wasn't the end of our journey. It was only the beginning. The intercom's voice echoed through the carriage again, but this time it was different, colder, more insistent. "Next stop, the end." The words hung in the air like a threat, a final countdown that felt impossible to ignore. I could see Luna, still kneeling on the floor, struggling to catch her breath, her face pale from whatever ordeal she had just endured. Her transformation, her power, it had drained her. She was human again, but something had changed. Her eyes still glowed faintly, a reminder of what she had become and what was yet to come. I didn't know what the end meant, but I could feel it. The weight of the words, the tension in the air. It was like the train itself was holding its breath, preparing for whatever came next. Luna slowly stood up, her hands shaking, but her gaze was resolute. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "The end. It's not just a place. It's the last stop, and we have to get off before it's too late." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I knew she wasn't wrong. This train, this nightmare, wasn't like anything I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a ride. It was a test, a journey through realms and realities that didn't make sense. And every stop, every turn, had brought us closer to something darker, something that none of us could escape from. Not unless we did something now. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, I thought the world was going to collapse around us. But Luna stepped forward, her hand gripping my arm tightly. "Listen," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're not alone in this. There are others who've been on this train for far longer than us. People who've lost everything. Some of them are still fighting to escape, and others." She paused, her expression hardening. "Some of them have given in, but you don't have to. We can end this together." The train slowed, the noise of the wheels grinding to a halt, filling the air. It felt like time had stopped. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had a feeling that whatever came next would change everything. The end wasn't just a stop, it was the final test. The moment where everything, our fates, our choices, would come to a head. We made our way to the door of the carriage, the cold metal beneath our feet feeling heavier with each step. The train had stopped. The darkness outside was thick, impenetrable, but I could hear it. Whispers, distant voices, the The faint sound of footsteps. The shadows were moving, and they weren't alone. "This is it," Luna said, her voice steady now. "Once we step off this train, we're free, or we're trapped forever. There's no turning back." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. She had accepted it. She had accepted that whatever lay beyond this moment was beyond our control, beyond anything we could understand. I turned to the door and pushed it open, the cool night air rushing in, swirling around us like a storm. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a breath. Deep, real, and free. Whatever the end was, it was coming. But we were ready. As we stepped off the train, the world began to shift. The darkness enveloped us, but the light, the kind of light that only comes from a place beyond understanding, pierced through. And just as I thought the ground beneath me would give way, I heard one final whisper on the wind. "It's over." I looked around, feeling the weight of these words. The train was gone. The reality we knew was gone. But the journey had ended. And in that moment, I understood. The end wasn't something to fear. It was just another beginning. The train, the realms, the endless ride, they were all gone. The shadows dissolved into the light, and everything was still. And as I stood there, at the threshold of this new world, I realized that sometimes, to find freedom, you have to be willing to step off the edge of everything you've ever known. And so we did.